Testing? Okay. Hi everyone, if you want to gather around, we're just going to start off with some songs by the Sydney Trade Union Choir. And then once these guys have sung for us and got us in the mood, we'll start with some speeches before the rally. So round of applause for the Sydney Trade Union Choir. Is that ready to go? All right. Hi everyone, that was a great entrance from the student contingent over there and the medical students as well. Give them a round of applause. So welcome everyone. It's great to see you all here today. I'm Caitlin Doyle-Markwick from the Refugee Action Coalition. I'm going to be chairing the rally today. But before we begin, we're just going to have an acknowledgement of country by Auntie Bronwyn Penrith. She's been an advocate for Aboriginal women's issues for 20 years and is a staunch advocate in her community. So welcome Auntie Bronwyn.
Thank you for that introduction. Wrestle with this microphone, yeah? My name is Bronwyn Penrith. I'm a Wiradjuri woman, is my bloodlines. I've been in Redfern for over 45 years, and I now claim this place as my home. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to think that the spirits of my people walk among us today. Certainly we know that they walk these lands, the very lands we stand on, for many thousands of years. We know that the main streets of Sydney were old thoroughfares, walking tracks. I like to think that Aboriginal people, in my experience, have a history of welcoming those who were not part of the mainstream, have made their homes with Aboriginal people and in Aboriginal communities. I'd like to invoke the names of Barangaroo, who was a major activist and fighter, and who I think would be turned in her grave if she knew that the suburb that was being named after her and what happens there. I'm pretty sure she'd be pretty unhappy about that. So with all that in mind, I'd like to welcome you here today on behalf of the Gadigal people in this the Eora Nation. And I'd like to say that Eora is actually the anglicised version of the word Yawara, which is a traditional name. And I'd like to take a moment to reflect on my feelings about the treatment of people who have been left outside of Australia, who are not truly welcomed in this country. As I said, Aboriginal people have always offered a safe haven for those in need. And I'd like to think that if it were the people who are coming by boats, by coming and being placed in detention, that Aboriginal people would certainly have welcomed them here on our land before they would others who had came to claim over. The history of Aboriginal people under colonisation has been horrific. And I'm very much saddened today when I see what is happening for the new people who wish to make their home here through circumstances beyond their control, really. Again, with that in mind, I just want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, acknowledge you fellas for being here. It's pretty fantastic to see all you fellas here today, and as far as I can see up there, which is not that far really, I can see the people who have come to show their support, show their disappointment. I was saying earlier when I was having a yarn that I'm starting to hate white people. I guess for us, white people are all those part of the establishment that we've always called. I guess we really mean those who are not able to extend the hand of friendship and freedom and sharing. And so I'd like to do that personally on behalf of myself, my family, and my mob. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Auntie Bronwyn. Yeah, so welcome everyone. I think it's really really fortuitous that this rally comes so close to the election that's coming up in the last few weeks. I'm really looking forward to making the refugee being part of a refugee campaign that continues to be a real pain in the neck for Morrison and his government in the lead up to that election. Yes. Have an applause for that. We're also coming off the back of a huge win for the campaign in the form of the Medivac bill that was passed on the first day of Parliament sitting this year. That was an extraordinary blow to Morrison's racist government and represents, a serious crack in the bipartisan support for offshore cruelty in this country. So I think that's, we can really take heart from that. And it's an absolutely humiliating defeat for Morrison on the first day of Parliament, and the first time in 90 years that a sitting government's lost a significant vote on the floor of Parliament like that. So let's not let him forget that today and really stick it to him. And, while I think we can certainly take heart from the Medivac bill and the fact that we got all kids off Nauru at the beginning of this year after an enormous, excellent campaign at the end of last year, there are unfortunately still 914 people left on Manus Island and Nauru. And the US deal is now virtually exhausted, and the offer to take 150 people from New Zealand is not going to be enough to get those people to come to Australia and into our communities where they belong. So we're going to need to continue to fight for that, and this is a very good place to start today, I think. And I think it's also fitting that the medical students, the Australian Medical Students Association, are going to be leading the rally today. They stand in a proud tradition of doctors, nurses and healthcare workers who have been a very central part of this campaign from the beginning, carrying on that tradition. So I congratulate you guys. Well done for organising your contingent today. I think, we can see that Morrison has really been scrambling to claw back some votes by, ramping up the anti-refugee racism in the lead up to the election. And I think, and let's not forget that he's actually guilty of what must be possibly the most expensive election stunt in history. It cost $185 million to reopen Christmas Island, only to announce a couple of weeks ago that they're now going to close it as part of the budget. What an absolute disgrace. Yeah, shame. But I think also it has to be said his racist fear-mongering is particularly revolting coming from the coalition in the wake of the Christchurch attacks that we saw a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure all of us here today stand in solidarity with our Muslim brothers and sisters in New Zealand, here in Australia and across the world. Yeah. And we absolutely reject the Islamophobia that's come not only from the far right but the mainstream of politics in this country for far too long. And I think there's an undeniable connection between this Islamophobia and the anti-refugee rhetoric coming from the likes of Dutton. But it was very pleasing to see that after Morrison's ridiculous press conference on Christmas Island and his attempts to demonise refugees and suggest that the people on Manus Island and Nauru are some kind of threat to ordinary people in Australia, he didn't get an ounce of a boost in the pre-election polls. And I think people are increasingly able to see through this cynical fear-mongering and see it for what it is. And I think the refugee movement has been key to pushing back that racism and not allowing Morrison and co to divide us. And so on that note, we have an excellent lineup of speakers today that represent different wings of the refugee movement. A movement that every week becomes broader and deeper and pulls different groups into its orbit that are determined to see an end to refugee cruelty. So on that note, I'll announce our first speaker, who is, and I have to pass on apologies from Dr. Munjed Al-Naderis, who was supposed to speak. He's an Iraqi surgeon. He's on a humanitarian mission to Iraq, so that unfortunately clashed with this, but, we can't be too grumpy about that. So first up, we've got Craig Foster. He's a former Socceroo and football commentator who is an excellent, important advocate for the Bahraini soccer player Hakim Al-Arabi, who was detained in Thailand last year, threatened with deportation, and Craig's support and the campaign that built up behind Hakim was absolutely essential in ensuring he was brought back home to Australia. So welcome, Craig.
Thank you everyone for the invitation to speak here today. It's a really important day, particularly heading into an election. I'm delighted to see so many people, not just here of course, but right around Australia. So hello to everyone who already this morning has been involved in rallies in other capital cities around the country. And to all of those who are watching, whether through streaming or other aspects of media, social media and the like. I want to start by just adding my voice to Auntie Bronwyn and welcome to country, very important, and I'm sure many of you, like I, will agree that we feel very strongly about the rights and the plight of our Indigenous Australians. Today, around refugee rights is something that's very close to my heart, and I think increasingly becoming close to the heart of all Australians. That was the point, wasn't it, of our recent campaign to save Hakeem, was a young Bahraini footballer who was incarcerated in a Bangkok prison. And interestingly, it wasn't just football, it wasn't just sport, it wasn't just Australians, but it was a hell of a lot of Australians, including politicians and key ones from the Prime Minister, bipartisan support right across the political spectrum, who stepped forward to save a young refugee footballer and uphold his human rights. And that moment, for that I thank all of you, but it's also a challenge to each and every one of us, in particular to those of our political leaders, who on one hand feel capable of stepping forward, and rightly so, to help this young man, and on the other can support policies which are frankly inhumane and which do not represent the heart and compassion of this country. The two cannot exist side by side. On one hand, if we fight for Hakeem, we must fight for everyone else. In that moment, we demonstrated that Australia is a place of compassion, that tens of millions of Australians feel strongly about treating every human being in a humane, fair and equal manner. And it's from the Hakeem campaign, it's the values, the compassion, the feeling, the trust and the shared community response that we have to carry forward now, not just into this election, but well beyond. For all of us is a challenge though. We acknowledge here that, and all of you have been working in this field for a very long time. Just for a moment, I'd like to speak to, I guess, a little bit more like me, the rest of Australia who haven't attended all these rallies for the last 20 years, who haven't been deeply embedded in this really incredibly important issue that goes to the heart of who Australia is and who we are as people. But people like me who've been going about our lives, who felt strongly about the issue, but not strongly enough to come and stand here and speak to Australia, not strongly enough to support all of these wonderful refugee organisations, and certainly not strong enough to stand up as 25 million people and say this will not occur any longer. It's time for all of us to step forward. Yes, we can make decisions, and you will at the forthcoming election, and that's a matter for each and every one of you according to your conscience. But the national conscience of Australia is severely damaged. The 12 lives that have been cost on Manus and Nauru weigh heavily on the conscience of this nation, and that is me, you and everyone watching around the country. So as great as the Save Hakeem campaign was, and it was a wonderful outcome both for a young Bahraini refugee and I think for this nation, it was also an immense challenge to me, to you and to all other 25 million Australians. Because if we can save him, we can save everyone on Manus Nauru, we can save every refugee who deserves the right to asylum, and in the end, people, we can save ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Craig Foster, for that. So next up we have Judith Wright, who's the New South Wales State Secretary for the Australian Services Union. The ASU have been staunch supporters of refugees for many years, and a lot of other unions have been as well. And I think they're a very, very important part of this campaign. Morrison likes to tell us that he's protecting us from refugees, all the while he He attacks our rights at work, our unions, our superannuation, promotes tax cuts for big corporations and the wealthy, and at the same time spends $10 billion keeping their offshore processing camps open and torturing refugees. And I just want to give a shout out to the excellent contingents I can see from there, the NTEU, the National Tertiary Education Union, the USU. We've got the Teachers for Refugees somewhere over there. Can't see them right now, but they're always an excellent part of this campaign, and the Nurses Union as well. So thanks for being here. And I'll just give a quick shout out to the extremely brave teachers that walked out of school at the end of last year in Melbourne and Brisbane to support to demand that the kids were brought off Nauru. That was an extremely inspiring example for us all. Let's give a warm welcome to Judith Wright. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to welcome all of you and thank you for coming today, and want to especially acknowledge Unions for Refugees, union members and especially ASU members. I'm proud to stand here today before you to reaffirm that ASU members support humane and just treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, and are opposed to mandatory detention, offshore processing and turnbacks. Refugees are workers and refugees are union members. The treatment of refugees is a social justice issue, and social justice is union business. The ASU has 13,000 members in New South Wales and the ACT, including 9,000 members in the social and community services industry. Members in this industry provide vital support services to refugees, including those working in settlement services, trauma counselling services, community neighbourhood centres and community legal centres. ASU members see firsthand the devastation caused by war, conflict and political oppression, and how policies of successive governments in Australia have compounded this trauma. We have a Prime Minister who is unflinching in the face of suicide, child sexual abuse, serious illness, and all of the horrors of offshore detention. Just 2 months ago, he led the most extraordinary attack on the Medevac legislation, which had the simple and humane purpose of ensuring that 6 refugees and asylum seekers could get the medical care they needed in Australia because it wasn't available on Manus or Nauru. First, we heard the usual hollow rhetoric that the legislation would undermine border security. Then Scott Morrison supported Peter Dutton's disgraceful lie that the arrival of refugees to Australia for essential medical care would result in Australians being kicked off public hospital waiting lines. We then saw the reopening of Christmas Island at a cost of $185 million to the Australian people at a time of record low wage growth and inequality. So why do we still have inhumane and draconian policies in relation to refugees and asylum seekers? Well, the answer is simple. Scott Morrison's government needs to demonise refugees to ensure that the dissatisfaction of working people with low income, job insecurity and housing stress is channelled away from big business and government. Shame. There are many things that we as union members can do about this. Firstly, we need to educate our workmates, family and neighbours that asylum seekers, refugees and other marginalised groups and community members are not the cause of poverty, unemployment and homelessness. Refugees are not taking away our homes, our welfare and our jobs. In a fair society, there should be plenty of these to go around for everyone. We need to change the opinions of fellow union members and other colleagues who may have bought the line that our shameful government policies are preventing deaths at sea. There's an opportunity to do this through the ACTU Change the Rules campaign, which is aimed squarely at holding government and big business responsible for low wages, insecure jobs, penalty rates cuts and unfair taxes. With the election only 5 weeks away, the campaign is in full flight, and as well as rallies which happened around the country last week and a national door knock yesterday, unions are encouraging members to hold workplace meetings to pass resolutions to change the rules so that we can improve the lives of working people in Australia. These workplace meetings are a great opportunity for union members to talk to other members and potential union members about refugees and asylum seekers, about the conflicts and wars they are fleeing from, about the trauma they have experienced, about why getting on a boat and risking their lives is often the only option. Unions have members who are refugees and members whose paid or volunteer work involves supporting refugees. These union members are in a unique position to share stories about both the struggles and amazing contributions of refugees and to change public opinion. We should make a concerted effort to make this happen. We know from the many campaigns that union members have championed, including marriage equality, climate change and paid family and domestic violence leave, that public support often occurs years before either side of politics is prepared to even consider changing laws. We know that public opinion changes because of the sharing of personal stories. Comrades, keep on sharing those stories. Let's tell our family, friends, neighbours, colleagues and politicians that we need to end turnbacks. We need to end mandatory detention. We need to bring them here, and that refugees are always, always welcome in our workplaces, in our communities, in our suburbs, in our country. Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much, Judith. And so our next round of speakers, appropriately, so today is the Palm Sunday rally. Today is a sort of traditional day of peace in the amongst a lot of church denominations. So we have a couple of speakers now. And I think it must be said that a lot of churches around the country have been a really important part of the refugee campaign, you know, really supporting refugees within their own communities, using their congregations and churches to build support for refugees as well. And with the campaign around Love Your Way, you know, they're a really important part of this campaign. So to speak for us today, we've got Reverend John Barr from the Uniting Church, Father Claude Mostovic from Pax Christi, and Father Shenouda Mansour. So please welcome them to the stage.
Refugees are welcome here in Australia. Yes or no? It's time for us that we say to the rest of Australia, we're all Australians and Australia is built by migrants. Is that true or not? There are 67 million people who are displaced around the world. And a place like Australia, 25 million, only the southeastern corner, a very small strip. Australia can have multiple 25 million. And it's time for us to stand for refugees, because refugees are human beings. They are not labels. They are people like you and me. And that is the case. We need a movement of change of hearts. Refugees are many people like you and me. Look in their eyes, look in their faces. They're a reflection of yourself and myself. And as Jesus walked into Jerusalem, people laid their garments and the leaves, and the olive leaves and victory of palm leaves. We also need to give them dignity as human beings. And we say to them with open hearts, you are welcome here in Australia. You are our brothers and our sisters, and it's time for this movement to change. Says, refugees are welcome here. Thank you very much. As you know, today is Palm Sunday, and it's certainly very much a day in which Christians especially, but other people too, would commemorate a journey. And we're here today because many people have taken journeys, and this week we commemorate the journey that Jesus takes towards the cross. Palm Sunday is also called Passion Sunday. And it's just that the suffering that Christ suffered. But not only that, it's also the passion in terms of hunger and thirst and enthusiasm for justice and peace and truth. This is also very much important. I said here last year that I've been involved with refugees and migrants for over 40 years. And I've been coming to these rallies for nearly 20 years, and little seems to have happened or changed for the better. And many of you have done the same thing. And I want to say, don't stop, because it's important for us. It's really important for us, as we heard, that our humanity is tied up with people who are suffering. As we heard, they are not numbers, they're not labels, they are human beings just like us, flesh and blood. And what we commemorate on this Palm Sunday is that of a human being who comes into a city not riding on a horse with power and so on, but on a donkey, to let us know that he walks alongside us. And whether we are Christian or not, it doesn't matter. Our humanity is tied up with the poor, the unjustly treated, the abused, the neglected. As we walk with them, then we are also doing what is most humane and compassionate. Let's not stop. If you have been coming for many years, don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged, because we can't live with ourselves, or I can't at least, if I stop coming. And so please keep coming. Thank you for your presence here. And I'd like to also acknowledge the various groups here, that the colleagues, the Josephite sisters and others, and Ulster sisters and so on, who are very much tied with us in this journey. It's a journey that we all take for people who are suffering, our sisters and brothers.
I too wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and upon which we stand, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Well, I'm here like the rest of you today to simply say yes to refugees. This gathering here today on Palm Sunday is truly significant, for what we are doing is clearly very important. For you see, saying yes to refugees is not only the decent, fair or honourable thing to do, it is the right thing to do. As a representative of the Christian churches in this city, I want to reiterate that a fundamental teaching of my faith, and indeed the faith of many people around the world, is this: that we must never neglect, exploit, oppress or marginalise those who are newcomers in our community. We must never stigmatise, vilify or cast a slur on the foreigner in our midst. Rather, we are to embrace, we are to accept, and we are to love the newcomer as one of our own. In the kind of world that Palm Sunday proclaims, there is in fact no other. There is no alien. There is no foreigner. Rather, there is one common humanity created in the image of God. Yet what is the mantra of our government? What is the narrative of those in power in Canberra? It is to stigmatise those who seek asylum by labelling them as queue jumpers, as illegals, and as a threat to our national security. It is to push the buttons that ramp up racism and promote an irrational, indeed despicable fear of the other. It is to remain silent while extreme right-wing voices in this country raise their ugly heads to demean those who are perceived as being different. It is to justify that horrific, immoral thing we call detention, as hundreds of people remain imprisoned for no other reason than they are fleeing violence, persecution, and injustice. Friends, I want to thank you for being here today. May this gathering be a means of sending a loud message to Canberra that refugees are welcome. May this gathering here today be a means of declaring we're not going to take the rhetoric, the scaremongering, the alarmist and totally dishonest spin that comes out of Canberra in the form of a refugee policy. On this Palm Sunday, on this day of peace, and on this day of love for all humanity, we say yes. We say yes to our common humanity. We say yes to decency and justice. We say yes to that which is right. We say yes to refugees.
Yes to refugees! Yes to refugees! Yes to refugees!
That was great. I just want to pick up on something that Father Claude just said. I think it's important to remember that we do have to keep fighting. And amongst all this, that to acknowledge the wins that this campaign has had. It might have been Karen Phelps who proposed the Medivac bill earlier this year, and that the Greens and the Labor Party that voted it through. But they did so because they felt the pressure from a campaign that's been working away tirelessly for years. Holding rallies, vigils, writing articles and letters to MPs, passing motions of support in our unions and universities. And I think all of this slow, patient work adds up to one very mighty campaign. I think it's really important to remember that this campaign does have wins, and despite how exasperated we might feel at the extent of the cruelty of Australia's refugee policy, both offshore and onshore, we've stopped deportations, we've had people brought to Australia for urgent medical care, we've had to push past Peter Dutton's absolute cruelty to make sure that refugees who have died offshore have been given a dignified burial where their families are wanted to. And we can't forget the almighty campaign that we had last year to get all kids off Nauru. And I think acknowledgement also has to be paid to the brave refugees themselves who have resisted on Manus and Nauru from day one, and in the onshore detention centres as well. The incredible, valiant protests that we've seen in the most incredibly difficult circumstances. And I think, those are the kind of people that we want right here in our communities. So I'll announce our next couple of speakers. So next up we've got Dr. Vince Scapatura. He's a lecturer at Macquarie Uni in politics and international relations, and he's a supporter of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And he'll be followed by Dr. Alison Bronowski, who's a former Australian diplomat.
Thank you very much to the organisers for today's event, and of course to all of you and all the various groups who have come out today to this rally. It really is very heartening and inspiring to see so many people here, and it's a great honour for me to be speaking here before you today. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Of course, it is no coincidence that our government's cruel and degrading treatment of asylum seekers and refugees should occur in the context of a long history of brutal colonial repression and dispossession. A significant theme of Australia's early colonial history was a widespread fear that just as they had dispossessed the original owners of this land, white European invaders and settlers might too one day be Aboriginalised, as they described it. Successive Australian governments have capitalised on this deep-seated and racialised fear of the other to justify not only racist immigration restriction policies and hostility to asylum seekers, but a dependent and militarised foreign policy that has led Australia to invade so many countries that have posed no threat to us at the behest of Britain or America. What's even more worrying is that these uniquely and historically embedded pathologies in our political culture are being amplified in a world where the centre is collapsing across democratic nations and a frightful resurgence of extreme right-wing xenophobic movements is asserting itself. And so today it is vitally important for us to remember, as we rightly condemn Australia's refugee policies and demand that they be disbanded and replaced with humane alternatives, that we also recognise how all of these ugly elements of Australian domestic and foreign policy are linked. That violence and militarism on the domestic front is linked to violence and militarism abroad. And that as we say yes to refugees in Australia, we must also say yes to a peaceful and independent and non-nuclear Australia. Because it is not an unrelated fact that the same place where Australia built that prison of abuse on Manus Island to deter would-be asylum seekers from seeking protection, Australia is now building a military base in conjunction with the United States to project power across the region. Our alliance with the United States, and particularly the US military base at Pine Gap, hardwires Australia into America's global war-making and refugee-producing machine. From our participation in unjust and illegal wars and drone strikes across the Middle East, to the potential to be dragged into a future conflict between America and China with potentially unimaginable and devastating consequences. It is not an unrelated fact that as Australia's foreign aid budget drops to record lows, our military spending has soared to unprecedented heights. Australia is intending to spend $1 trillion on our military over the next 2 decades. As UNHCR declares that the number of displaced people in the world has reached record heights as a result of war and conflict, our government has set an entirely different record-breaking goal: to become one of the world's top 10 exporters of weapons, to profit off this endemic violence and repression. And it is not an unrelated fact that Australia is militarising its borders just as it is accelerating the dangers of the 2 biggest threats facing humanity: climate change and nuclear war. It is a militarised mindset that leads top defence thinkers today to advocate Australia prepare its defence forces to push back the inevitable large-scale movement of people who will be forced to flee widespread political instability and civilisational collapse that we know climate change will leave in its wake if we don't do something about it. And it is a militarised mindset that led the Australian government to defy the majority of the nations of the world and domestic public opinion by refusing to sign the recent historic treaty on ban of nuclear weapons, to defy the efforts to make these inhumane weapons illegal under international law and prohibit their development, testing, production, stockpiling, stationing, transfer, use, and threat forevermore. This has been a monumental failure for Australia and another reflection of our sordid colonial history and mindset. For it was in Australia that nuclear weapons were used and tested on the traditional owners of this land in the 1950s. And it was in Australia in the 1980s, in these very same Palm Sunday protests, that the anti-nuclear movement contributed to a global effort to successfully negotiate significant arms reduction treaties that are now being teared up by our most sacred strategic partner, the United States under the Trump administration. And it was in Australia that ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, was born. The same campaign that won the Nuclear Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its historic contribution in getting the nuclear ban treaty passed at the United Nations. It is a monumental failure of the Australian government because the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists warns us that it is just 2 minutes to midnight, that terrifying metaphor for total darkness that is predicted to eventuate from a nuclear winter and result in the end of humanity. But there is also every reason not to despair and to be hopeful and to act for change. The Nuclear Ban Treaty is gaining momentum. It passed the United Nations on 7th of July 2017 with 122 nations in favour. And just yesterday, Panama became the 23rd state to ratify the treaty. When that number reaches 50, the Nuclear Ban Treaty will come into legal force. And after a monumental exercise in civil society pressure, the Australian Labor Party has committed to Australia signing and ratifying the Nuclear Ban Treaty if they were to win the next federal election. However, there are many forces that could torpedo that commitment. The same mindset that has militarised Australia's border protection policies, including the Australian Labor Party, is fearful of letting go of a militarised and nuclearised defence policy, and especially the so-called nuclear umbrella of the United States. So we must keep up the pressure on our parliamentarians of every political stripe if this battle is to succeed. And so I urge you to contact your local parliamentarians at the council, state and federal level and urge them to sign on to ICANN's pledge and to commit working towards Australia signing and ratifying the Nuclear Ban Treaty. You can find the pledge and a host of other campaigns that you can become involved in on the ICANN Australia website. If we are to succeed in challenging Australia's abysmal treatment of asylum seekers, then we must chip away at that militarised mindset, that deep-seated pathology that infects so much of Australia's political culture in domestic and foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm only allowed 1 minute, so listen up. I represent Australians for War Powers Reform, which for 5 years has been trying to change the law, to stop the Prime Minister of this country being able to send troops without any kind of discussion or debate or vote in the Parliament to disastrous wars like Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. We've now got a campaign up, and here it is. And I'm going to keep holding this up so that you can put it on your Facebook page and find it, and you can see our petition and sign it. The Be Sure on War campaign is what we have created, and in December we got the ALP National Conference to agree that in the first term of a Labor government, they will begin an inquiry into how Australia goes to war with a view to changing the law so it doesn't happen anymore. And there's a reason for all of you people who are feeling so passionate about the refugee issue, for all of you to support us, because wars create refugees. And we want to stop Australia creating illegal wars. So the things are linked one to the other. So get it up and sign our petition, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Dr. Bronowski. I think you packed a lot into that 1 minute. Well done. So our last speaker today is Shagufta Tahiri. She's a human rights advocate, a Hazara woman and former refugee herself. So make Shagufta welcome.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay my utmost respect to leaders past, present, and future. Palm Sunday, a day when Christians are reminded of the call to be peacemakers, which I, as a Muslim and a former refugee from Afghanistan, stand strongly with. We must come to terms with the fact that refugee policies has done and is doing great harm to thousands of highly vulnerable people seeking protection from harm. The public have been made to feed into the politics of fear and believe that people seeking asylum and refugees are dangerous groups that the nation needs to overcome, or at best are portrayed as helpless and damaged victims who can never be assets to the Australian community. It was precisely 4 years ago where I stood here and spoke of the harm refugee policies were doing. I stand here again 4 years later, and refugee policies have reached unprecedented level of harm. So today we have the right to be upset, because this harm is as a consequence of carefully engineered policies of deterrence, policies that have been the mechanisms of harming thousands who are in fact living in our communities, marginalized, and the sacrifice of the damaging rhetoric of saving lives at sea or measures of strong borders. Currently, we can see this harm in the form of serious mental health issues facing more than thousands of refugees and people seeking asylum who remain detained on Nauru and Manus Island 5.5 years later after they sought Australia's protection. The 1,300 people who are subjected to extended immigration detention in Australia, the 6,000 people living on bridging visas who had all assistance cut off over the past 2 years, many of whom who are now experiencing homelessness and destitution, and the 15,000 refugees who arrived by boat who have been given temporary protection visas only and must live with the constant fear of being returned to their country of origin to persecution at a later date, and the thousands of recognized refugees who are subject to years of family separation and thousands of deliberate citizenship delays. We can say, without any fear of contradiction, that Australia's asylum policies have never been worse or more harmful than it is now. But we cannot give up in despair. We must work for change, building alliances with people across the political spectrum who are prepared to support humane and practical alternatives for people seeking refuge. And we can see that public and political sentiment is starting to change. In August, the umbrella organization Refugee Council of Australia that I work with and support was one of the 4 organizations to launch the Kids of Nauru campaign. When we started, there was 119 refugee children in Nauru. Today, there are none. We got involved in the Wentworth by-election campaign to try to demonstrate to the candidates that electors in the state did not support Australia's mistreatment of people seeking asylum. It worked. And the newly elected MP for Wentworth, Dr. Karen Phelps, became a strong voice in the Parliament for refugees. Concerned about deaths of refugees on Nauru and Manus Island caused by inadequate medical care, Dr. Phelps and other MPs worked with the organizations involved in the Kids of Nauru campaign and the medical organizations to legislate for change. In February, despite the government's opposition, the Parliament passed legislation to ensure that decisions about medical evacuations to Australia are made on medical, not political grounds. To effect change, we have to be united, coordinated, clear, and constructive about what we are trying to achieve. During 2017, we worked with a variety of organizations involved in campaigning on refugee issues to come up with a common platform, outlining the most pressing issues which needed to be addressed and clear policy alternatives. The end result was a 5-part platform for change, calling for 1, the permanent end to offshore processing, 2nd, a fair process for claiming asylum, 3rd, reform of the immigration detention system, 4th, a larger and more responsive refugee humanitarian program, and 5th, Australia's improved engagement in Asia in finding answers for refugees. We worked behind the scenes to take the ideas in this platform to the Labour Party in the lead up to its recent national conference. As a result, a number of the ideas in this platform are included in the Labour's revised party platform currently. We have formed working groups for each of these 5 areas of policy, developing strategies on how we push them in the first 6 months after the election with whichever party is elected to the government. we have launched the Choose Humane campaign, as you can see in my t-shirt, to back this platform for change and to demonstrate that Australians want refugee policies which are humane, not cruel. We are asking people nationwide and across the country to sign the Choose Humane pledge, which we then will deliver to the leaders of all political parties. And then straight after the election, we will deliver a copy of the Platform for Change with a number of people who have pledged their support to all key members of parliament and senators. The more people who take the pledge, the stronger the message of the Australians that want humane, not cruel refugee and asylum policies. So, and often the most common question asked is, how can I support, how can I contribute to the change that we are seeking to achieve? And fortunately, despite the very complex political environment, there is an answer for you, and it's the 20-second tasks. So if I could actually ask you to take out your phones right now, ready? And go to the choosehumane.org.au, scroll down, and you will see the link to signing up for the pledge. And I'll give you 15 seconds to actually sign up to the pledge that we choose humane policies over cruel policies. Choose Humane, CHOOSEHUMANE.org.au. You got 15 seconds, so I'll count it down. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 2.5, 2, 1.5, 1. Done? If you haven't actually done it, you can continue doing it. But for those who hate technology, there's actually a table, Choose Humane table over there, next to a tree. You can go there and sign up for Choose Humane campaign. And if you want to even go further, you can actually sign up to volunteer with this campaign that is nationwide. And even further, purchase a t-shirt and wear it proudly like I have done now. And you can even, take a selfie and post on Twitter, #ChooseHumane. On final remarks though, the only way forward for us is to be strategic, coordinated, hold the parties accountable to their commitments, and for that we need a shared vision to show politicians that public opinion has changed. And frankly, we need to find ways to communicate with those that we disagree with. We also need to remember that refugee crisis worldwide, and most importantly, domestically in Australia, is as much about us than about an unsolved, distant issue. Because we all stand on the shoulders of good people who did not look away when we were in need. It might have been a century ago, it might have been last year. If we are to continue as people of compassion, we simply cannot look away from refugees and people seeking asylum, because there are people like you and me, and to borrow from Jacinda Ardern, they are us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shikufa. I think this rally is we're sending a really powerful message today with this rally to the Morrison government that public opinion is turning in favour of refugees and having the refugees brought off Madison Nauru. But I think in the election, it's important to remember it's a positive thing that the Labor Party has said that they'll get everyone out of the offshore processing centres if they win government. But the fact remains that despite their claims, they haven't found a third country to resettle those refugees. And the fact is that refugees and asylum seekers on Madison Nauru are Australia's responsibility. We're by far and away the richest country in this region and the most capable of providing security and safety. It's certainly not the responsibility of Cambodia or the Philippines to take care of the refugees that have come to Australia seeking safety and asylum. It is our responsibility to give them safety and to welcome them into our communities where they belong. So we also need to send a very loud and clear message today to the Labor Party and to Bill Shorten to demand that if they come to government, Manus and Nauru must be closed. And the refugees and asylum seekers there, men, women and children alike, must be brought here to live in our communities. Now, there are a lot of Labor members and supporters that do support refugees, and I acknowledge those within the ranks of the Labor Party, like Labor for Refugees and Young Labor in particular, who have been vocal in their opposition to offshore processing and boat turnbacks within the Labor Party. But we need to go far beyond lobbying within Labor and beyond simply voting at the ballot box this May 18th. Because I'm sure we don't need to remind people that, that Manus and Nauru were actually opened under a Labor government in 2013. What we need to do is build a movement that will make it absolutely impossible for those hellholes to stay open under any government whatsoever. So we need to continue to fight beyond the campaign, beyond the election this year. So I really encourage you to all get involved in the campaign if you aren't already. Just to let you know, there are a few campaigns that are ongoing. So, for example, there is the family Priya Nades and their two daughters, who are a Tamil family from Biloela. There's been an incredible campaign from that small town in Queensland to have them brought home. Unfortunately, they were Priya was redetained in March 2018. So we're still fighting for that. So if you try to stay on top of that campaign. There's also a 45-year-old Tamil man whose friends call him Rajan. He's been held as an ASIO negative for 6 years before that was overturned, without ever being told what actually was the basis for that ASIO negative mark against his name. He was in detention for almost 10 years. And in that time, he was diagnosed with leukemia. So there's a petition at the moment to David Coleman, who's the immigration minister now, on change.org. So look that up and put your name to it. There's also an MEAA petition that's the Journalists Union to bring Behrouz Boochani to Australia. It's got thousands of signatures from journalists and from media workers. Please add your name to that as well. There's also a collection bucket going around for the Refugee Action Coalition. There's also Paywave, so if you don't have any coins, you can still give some money. And I will do a quick plug for the Refugee Action Coalition, which I'm representing today. We organise a lot of the rallies in Sydney. We organise forums and vigils and protests in response to different changes in refugee policy. We work with different community groups, religious groups, unions, and so forth. We're all sorts of people. We're retirees, we're students, we're teachers, we're all of it. We meet in Surrey Hills every Monday night at 6 p.m. We're going to be having a forum on the 1st of May. Please come along if you want to get involved, or find any of the RAC members here in the crowd. I'm sure you'll be able to spot them. They're probably wearing this shirt. And just a quick bit of housekeeping or directions. We're going to be walking up Eddy Avenue, left into Pitt Street, then along Broadway and up to Victoria Park. And we're going to be following the Palm Sunday banner for refugees, followed closely by the medical students. So I just want to finish on a chant to get us started, to send a loud message to Scott Morrison and the coalition government as we hopefully see them out. Scott Morrison, hear us say, bring them here, let them stay. Scott Morrison, hear us say, bring them here, let them stay. Scott Morrison, hear us say, bring them here, let them stay. Scott Morrison, hear us say, bring them here, let them stay. Scott Morrison, hear us say, bring them here, let them stay. Scott Morrison, hear us say, bring them here, let them stay.